I went through the Parasha, and I looked for Psalms that relate to the Parasha. Like you remember last year, for example, when we talked about the Psalms, we might talk about some of the Psalms of Korah. We might talk about some of the Psalms of Asaph. We might talk about Psalms of Ascent. So there were collections, Psalms that relate to personal development. That's kind of the things that we did. So here's what we're going to try. I looked for Psalms that would relate to the Torah reading. Let me tell you, I give no consideration to the Havdalah at all, only the Torah reading. And I looked for Psalms that would relate to the Torah. That was hard. You would think that with 4,000 years of Jewish history, and David having lived 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago, you would think that somewhere in Judaism, somebody would have come up with some kind of connection between the Psalms and the Torah. And there is nothing. It's never been done. Not that I can find. I asked Dr. Rudolph at TKU. I contacted Chabad. I went through Sidors. It doesn't exist. And I think I understand why. This is Torah. This is the way we should live. And here are stories. Torah is mostly stories. Here's stories that exemplify the way you should live. Or this is what happens when you don't live that way. Or here's stories that show what happens when you don't live that way. That's Torah. God's plan, right? That's Torah. The Psalms is completely different. As you saw last year, this is the Psalms. God, where are you? That's the Psalms. The Psalms is like life. And what happens when it doesn't work? And God, where are you? And my emotions are broken, and I got issues over here and issues over there. And so the Psalms don't really always connect very well with, it's a whole nother section of Scripture, Holy Scripture, written by the inspiration of God. So I looked for Psalms that if you are a person who is reading through Torah, like Steve and Jane have a Torah club, a Torah group that meets in their house. If you are a person who reads Torah on a weekly basis like that, then you'll probably find something. Now, I will admit this. There were some times when the best that I could do was to find a psalm, maybe one verse that connected with the Torah. Or maybe the psalm would connect with one verse of the Parasha reading. That's how, I can see why nobody's done this, but I looked for that. And I thought, so we're going to try it. If you're a Torah reader, then it will bless you in that. But I'm not going to teach on the Torah. I'm going to teach on the psalm. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And it's just going to drive how I've selected the psalms. And any psalm that we've taught on in the past, I just eliminated from the possibility for what we'll do this year. So we'll just do every psalm we're going to be doing. And every week, as you saw last time, even if they're connected in terms of like the Psalms of Korah or the Psalms of Asaph, they have that connection, but I don't connect the Psalms. Every lesson's a standalone psalm. And so that's what we'll do. So I pray this is a blessing to you. And I know that it's going to be for me. So you have a handout. And it's kind of this is actually, I hope that you will think that this psalm is one of those best psalms. And you know what I mean when I say that. If I were to say to this room, how many of you think Psalms 91 is phenomenal? Or how many of you think Psalm 23 is phenomenal? Right? Or how many of you think, right? You know what I'm saying? There's some psalms that just, wow, that's a great psalm. I think this is one of those psalms. Okay, so Psalm 24. Now, the Psalms, just kind of think, how do we get started here? And there's a reason for this, as you're going to see. There's sections of the Psalms that seem to form like a community block. I thought of the word community here. They seem to just fit a community block, if you will. The Psalms of Ascent, 120 through 134, would be sung as people would go up into the temple. Or the Egyptian Hallel, they're sung every Passover and also every Shavuot and every Tabernacles, Sukkot. But they're called the Egyptian Hallel because Psalm 114 mentions the Exodus. So even though they're sung on all three of the main feasts, they're called that because it mentions the Exodus. Or they're a group of Psalms. Or there's the 5 books of Psalms, a group of Psalms, if you will. And some of the connections in the Psalms seem a little less evident, like Psalm 3 looks like it's really written to be thought of in the morning, and Psalm 4 in the evening, and Psalm 5 in the morning, and Psalm 6 in the evening, and this back and forth, almost like the Psalms are intended to be this daily, twice a day kind of repetition. But by the way, Judaism does have a plan for reading the Psalms. This is the plan. Read the whole book every week is one plan, and the other plan is read the whole book every month. But they don't have any plan to connect it with anything. You just read the whole book. And then some of the blocks, they're just not entirely continuous. But they look like they belong together. Like there's basically the Psalms from the sons of Korah, Psalms 42 through 49, and then with one exception, Psalms 84 through 88. There's 2 blocks of, they like a community, if you will, of Psalms. Or the Psalms of the sons of Asaph. Other than Psalm 50, they're all together in one place in the book. Well, I think Psalm 22, 23, and 24 seem to present a block of Psalms, a block of thought. And here's the block, if you will. You will remember probably that Psalm 22 is this psalm that's the Psalm of the Cross. I mean, the Lord quotes it. One of his quotes, one of the things he says, the 7 sayings of the Lord from the cross. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's Psalm 22, verse 1. And anybody who would have heard that would have immediately just in his mind would have thought everything in that psalm. They would have just gone down in their mind what else is in that psalm. And they would have seen things like Psalm 22, verse 16. They pierced my hands and my feet, and here he is up there on the cross. And there are many other things you might remember if you go through the book of Psalm 22 that just seem to point to the cross. And it's just the Psalm of the cross. Okay, that's something from our perspective is in the past. The cross. And then you come to Psalm 23, which looks like, frankly, it's for today. The era we're living in. The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. Now he is going to provide what I need. And he's going to make me lie down and give me rest in green pastures. He's not going to have to do that when I get to heaven. He's going to lead me beside the still waters in this world. He restores my soul. I'm not going to need that on the second day I'm in heaven. This is for now. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, no one's going to do that when they leave this world. We walk through the valley. You've heard the cliche, we walk through it, we don't stop, we just pass through it. You know, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you're with me, and your rod and your staff, they're going to protect me and comfort me and bring me. And you're preparing a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and you're anointing me with the oil of the Spirit. And my cup runs over. Everybody's cup's going to run over in heaven. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. That's my legacy. I'm going to leave something good behind. And I'm going to dwell eternally in the house of the Lord. Clearly, that psalm, it just looks like it follows the cross of Psalm 22 into the psalm of today, Psalm 23, and into the psalm that seems to point to the glorious day of the Lord, Psalm 24. Now, if you were, just before we read it, but if you notice on page 3 of your handout, I always give this, the Sansino, almost always, I put what they say about the psalm. And basically what they say about the psalm, I'll tell you is this. They say this psalm was written when David was bringing the ark into Jerusalem. He had tried once before, and you'll remember people died. And now he is with success bringing it in. You remember the story of Michal. Michal wasn't too happy, his wife, and she ended up getting judged by God in the story of 2 Samuel chapter 6. But he's bringing the ark back into the temple. And so the predominant view is this psalm was written as the ark, in that experience of the ark being brought back into Jerusalem. There are some people, good scholars also, but that's not the majority view. That's the majority view. There are other scholars who think this psalm could have been like Psalm 68, written at any of those times when Israel would have brought the ark out to battle, because they did, and then as they brought the ark back from battle, right? And so the psalm may have been written in connection with one of those battles. But I think that one of the things that you can see as we read this psalm is there seems to be this discussion. And a lot of the psalms have this. I've a little bit mentioned it, but I've never really taken the time to really show it to you. But for example, Psalm 136, it'll say something and then it'll say, and his mercy endures forever. So it's obviously, and it'll say that verse over and over again, like there's a line and then his mercy endures forever. There's a line, his mercy. So it's this like discussion, right? Well, this psalm's really got it, this discussion. And you can see it. So the first, I'm on page 2. The first couple verses are this, it's like opening it up as this hymn of praise. And then in verse 3, it's like worshipers who are in the room or in the area, not in the room, who are in the area are crying out, hey, who can go up into your presence, God? And then in verse 4 through 6, the priests respond to that question. And then in verse 7, not the priests, but the people carrying the ark now respond. Now, let me just tell you, if you look in different places, not all of the commentaries will point this liturgy out, but about half of them will, more than half of them. And they won't, they'll say, well, though they may offer who's saying which part differently, but many of them will say there's clearly a discussion here. See the picture here? So this isn't what I did. It may not match exactly, but it's pretty close to word biblical commentary. But I also considered what the others said. And then in verse 8, there's this gatekeeper's response. Now, that's not the ark carriers. Can you see the difference? That's not the ark carriers. That's the gatekeepers. And then the ark carriers respond to the gatekeepers. And then the gatekeepers ask a question. And then there's the ark carrier's response. Can you see that? So I have some volunteers who are going to help me with this. Okay, here we go. A Psalm of David. The earth is the Lord's, and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters.
Who may ascend to the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place?
He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. He shall receive blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation. This is Jacob, the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face.
Lift up your heads, O you gates, and be lifted up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in.
Who is this King of glory? The Lord is strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle.
Lift up your heads, O you gates, lift up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in.
Who is this King of glory?
The Lord of hosts, he is the King of glory.
That's how this psalm is like. It's like one section after another, and this describing this liturgy, if you will. So it became a liturgy. It became this, we Jewish people like liturgy, right? It became this liturgy to celebrate the temple. And I think you can see Psalm 22. the cross. Psalm 23, today. Psalm 24, one day the Lord is going to split the heavens and the heavenly gates. Fling wide, you heavenly gates. We actually, last Sunday, I knew I was going to be doing this psalm. And unfortunately, our technology, and this is kind of weird, but the technology in the room doesn't allow for me to play the song loud enough for you to be able to hear it. We tried. We know, actually, because we actually looked for help. It just won't. We're working on it, but it's nothing that our team could have done differently. But we sang this song last Sunday in the service. Martin Smith was here, remember? And I'm going to read you the words because I think you can hear. I don't know if he was thinking of this psalm when he wrote it or not, but I think you can hear it. Did you feel the mountains tremble? Did you hear the oceans roar? When the people rose to sing of Jesus Christ, the risen one. Did you feel the people tremble? Did you hear the singers roar? When the lost began to sing of Jesus Christ, the heavenly one. And we can see that, God, you're moving, a mighty river flowing through the nations. And young and old will turn to Jesus. Fling wide, you heavenly gates. Prepare the way of the risen Lord. Open up the doors and let the music play. Let the streets resound with singing. Songs that bring your hope. Songs that bring your joy. I love this line. If I have a favorite line in the psalm, it's this. Dancers who dance upon injustice. Fling wide, ye heavenly gates. Dancers who dance upon injustice. When he comes back, people are going to dance on injustice. Psalm 24, I'm going to the bottom of page 3 here. Psalm 24. It kind of opens up in this. Okay, so Psalm 24 is Psalm 23 in the Hebrew Bible. The Psalms are just like, for example, many of the Psalms, you know, that if they have a line in it that'll say Psalm by David or of the sons of Korah, that's typically, not always, but typically, that's verse 1 so in the Hebrew Bible, usually those kind of verses, this psalm does not break it out like that, but usually that will mean that psalm will have one more numbered verse in the Hebrew Bible because that title is verse 1. So what our English Bible calls verse 1 is typically verse 2 in the Hebrew Bible. So in the Hebrew Bible, the title is considered part of the scripture. Make sense? Okay, so, and there's other things that result, especially, for example, I believe it's Psalm 9 and 10 are considered one psalm in the Hebrew Bible, not in the English Bible. Why are they considered one psalm? You know what an acrostic is? Where the first verse begins with the letter Aleph, and the second, which is like A. And the second verse begins with the letter Bet, which is like a B. And so Psalm 9 and 10 make up one acrostic. So in the Hebrew Bible, that's one psalm. All right, so they get numbered differently, if you will. So Psalm 24 in the English Bible is Psalm 23 in the Hebrew Bible. Make sense? Okay, so what ends up happening then is the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek, and that's called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is, I think always, perhaps not always, but I think always, the Bible that Yeshua quotes. So I'm not one of those people who's down on the Greek, because he sure wasn't. Right? And the Jewish people wrote the New Testament in Greek. Right? And so I just see God using both languages. It's just beautiful. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that this psalm, though it's Psalm 23 in the Hebrew Bible, in the Greek Septuagint, Okay, so when the Bible gets translated into Greek, this becomes Psalm 23. And that Bible opens with this phrase, a Psalm of David of one of the Sabbaths. Now that phrase, of one of the Sabbaths, is not in the Hebrew Masoretic text. It's in the Greek text. Does that make sense? And so this question of does it belong in the Bible or not, and the discussions and scholars and all of that, but it's there. And it's there in Psalm. What's interesting is there's only one Psalm that actually mentions the Sabbath by name in the Hebrew Bible, Psalm 92. So we'll look at Psalm 92 the week that the Parasha would be, including Genesis 1 through 1 and 2. So, because the Sabbath's in there. So we'll do Psalm 92 that week. But there are 3 other Psalms that mention the Sabbath in the Greek Bible, though they're not mentioned, it's not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And one of those Psalms is this Psalm. And actually what it says, Psalmos to David tes mias Shabbaton, or Word Biblical Commentary translates that phrase like this, because it appears twice in this psalm. For the first day of the week, or on the day after the Sabbath. Now, the reason why that caught my attention, and the reason why you might find this interesting, if you look at your next page, the New Testament never says that Jesus rose from the dead on Sunday. This is what it actually says. He rose from the dead on day 1, as understood based on the Sabbath. Well, it's saying Sunday. It just doesn't say that. Because they told time based on the Sabbath. And you can find that in Matthew 28, verse 1. Now, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn. What does the Greek actually say? The exact same Greek that is found in Psalm 23 in the title. Eis mian Shabbaton. On the first day as counted by the Sabbath. Or you find the same thing in Mark 16:2, the same thing in Luke 24:1, the same thing in John 20, verse 1, the same thing in John 20, verse 19, the same thing in Acts 20, verse 7, the same thing in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. In other words, it wasn't like the early church ever switched from Saturday to Sunday. This is what the early church did. And this psalm kind of helps us see that. This is what the early church did. They kept Saturday as the Sabbath, and they added to it Sunday, because that's the Lord's day, because that's the day he rose from the dead. So they started to worship on 2 days. They never turned away from Saturday. They just added Sunday. So both days became vibrant days in the early church. Does that make sense? I just thought that was kind of cool. When I saw that, that's cool. I want to point that out. Psalm 24, verse 1. Wait, we're just getting up to verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and all who dwell therein. The earth, the Eretz, Eretz Yisrael, the word Eretz, the word for land or earth, and the world, Tevel, the word for the habitable world. So it's almost like it seems to call special attention to the land of Israel, the land, because the land is a common phrase in the Bible for the beautiful land or the land of Israel, and then every place, the whole world. It's like this place has special status, but God's everywhere. He's everywhere. Solomon said, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens can't contain you. How much less this temple which I have built? And there's two things that seem to belong to God, the psalmist is saying here in verse 1. The earth, the planet, and everything that's in it. Now, this is very different from all of the heathen deities. There's a thing in Midrash that says there's a story of a man who owned a ship, but he didn't own the cargo in the ship. And there's a story of another man who owned the cargo in his ship, but he didn't own the ship. And the point of Psalm 24 is God owns the ship and the cargo because he made everything out of nothing. Everything. There's nothing that exists that he did not make. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train, the shul of his robe filled the temple. The word is typically translated more often than anything with the word hem. The hem, this tiny little hem on my shirt. The hem of his robe. Not his shirt, not this thing that's hanging out back here, the hem. Israel, you're so worried that this good king Uzziah died. God's a whole lot bigger than that. The hem of his garment fills the whole temple in heaven. He's a big God. And he owns everything. It's all his. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. That word waters is actually the word for rivers. Kind of interesting. Most of the translations will actually get that, okay, like the TLV and the Complete Jewish Bible, the New American Standard Bible. The NLT actually puts ocean depths. It does not mean ocean depths. It means the rivers. And I thought that both seas and waters, seas or rivers, are both in plural. And I thought that was kind of interesting, again, because of this song. And we can see that, God, you're moving a mighty river through the nations. And young and old will turn to Jesus. Fling wide, you heavenly gates. Prepare the way of the risen Lord. Who's going to open these gates and let Messiah in when he comes back? That's the Psalm's question. A mighty river flowing through the nations. There's this picture of in ancient Jewish mythology that at the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, the waters, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. And he said, let there be light. And so what God did was, it's like he brought the land out of the sea, and he gave order to the chaos. Which is why in Jewish thinking, that really not all Jewish thinking, but a lot of Jewish thinking has this idea that Genesis is not the story of creation. It's the story of God fixing creation, having already created it, and Satan having done something, and God shows up to put it all back. In the beginning, God created. Sometimes people will call this the gap theory. It's not far into Jewish thinking. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, large expanse of time. And the earth then became without form and void. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. How could the earth be full of confusion? God is not the author of confusion. So how did it get so messed up? Somebody fell and messed it up. And God put people on the earth to bring order, to fill the earth and to subdue it. The snake was already in the garden. And Adam failed at subduing the snake. But the second Adam did not. He did not. And this was God's plan. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? And who may stand in his holy place? The question is now, okay, God, we're coming now. Who can actually come into your presence? Who can stand in your holy place? Okay, who can ascend? Who can stand? This, the holy place is clearly Zion. And I could have pulled out a half a dozen Psalms on this, but I pulled up just one. And those of us who are like as old as I am, I came to the Lord 40 years ago. Some of you remember the Psalm, Psalm 48. Does that look like a familiar song to some? If it does, you got to sing it with me because I won't do a good job of myself. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, and in the mountain of his holiness. Beautiful for situation is the joy of the whole earth, is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. Is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. That's the place. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who can stand in his holy place? People are saying, I want to come into God's presence. That's where I want to go. Psalm 15 essentially asks the same question. Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? He walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. He who does not put his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. He shall abide in the presence of the Lord. And this idea of abiding, then, is this New Testament equivalent here for who can stand on this holy mountain. And the New Testament clearly drives home this point in a number of places, but in no place is it more obvious than in John chapter 15, where the Lord 12 times will use this Greek word meno, to abide. And, you know, if you look at this, abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine and you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. I think that's interesting because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Without him, I can do nothing. But with him, I can do all things. What a difference. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gathered and threw them into the fire, and they're burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples. Clearly, this, I won't read it all, this passage is telling us that if we abide in him, and it leaves this evident thought. We have a part in this. I have a responsibility to abide, to actually stay in his presence. A couple years ago, we looked at the book of Hebrews, and we saw that, you know, for 40 years, they died in the wilderness. Some, like the Korah rebellion, went straight into Sheol, into the pit. But there's no reason to think that the people who died in the wilderness went to, en masse, went to hell. Moses died in the wilderness. Dying in the wilderness simply means that you did not get to do something that God would have had in mind for you to do. Moses died in the wilderness. And the vast, they all, except for Joshua and Caleb, all of them died in the wilderness. That doesn't mean they went to hell. It just means they didn't get to fulfill a plan that God had for them. When we abide, in his presence. We get to enjoy something that doesn't mean we're not going to heaven, but it does mean there's things that really, you're not just a pawn on a chessboard. Your free will is very significant. You make a difference. You're the one who's saying pawn to king 4. You don't lose that. God made you to be a thinking person. Psalm 24:4. Who can go up there? He who has clean hands and a pure heart. He who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. Clean hands, God seems to really care about our hands being clean. When you spread out your hands, I'll hide my eyes from you. Even though you make your prayers, I will not hear you because your hands are full of blood. Our hands matter. He who walks righteously and speaks uprightly. He who despises the gain of oppressions. He who gestures with his hands, refusing the bribes. His hands matter. I desire, therefore, that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. Hands matter. This doesn't mean we're saved by works, but hands matter. That if you will confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. Your tongue is an organ of the body, and with it you confess Yeshua. There is another organ in our body, and with it we confess Yeshua. What do you call a person who has the right confession here and the wrong confession with this? A hypocrite. This confession matters. It does not mean that I'm saved by this, but not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father. This has to match this, and this has to match this. Our lives matter. Does that make sense? That's why the New Testament says that God rewards everyone according to their works. Not saved by works, saved by grace. You make a decision to receive Yeshua, you go to heaven. You make a decision to reject Yeshua, you have a different destiny. But now that you're going to heaven, what will God do with you? He will reward you. And the rewards will be based upon your works. Some of their works will be burned up. Some of them are gold, silver, wood, precious stones, wood, fire, stubble. And so some of our works last and we get rewards, and some of them are burned up, and he himself shall be saved, yet as through the fire. So rewards, you only get rewards in heaven. You don't get punishments in heaven. So God says, you're going to heaven, you're going to get rewarded. What will those rewards be? That depends on your works. You reject Yeshua, you don't get to go to heaven. There's no rewards in hell. What will the punishments be? It's based on your works. Works matter. Only one thing makes the difference on heaven or hell. Yeshua, not works. Only one thing. But works do matter. Our lives do matter. The way we treat our spouse does matter. The way we treat our kids does matter. See the point? So, God cares about our hands. He cares about the pure heart. Jesus said that whoever looks with his heart to lust has already committed looks with his eyes to lust has already committed adultery in his heart. But he didn't commit adultery with his hand. He committed it with his heart. He broke the 10th commandment. He coveted his neighbor's wife with his heart. He did not break the 7th commandment, touching his neighbor's wife with his hands, so that the 10 commandments push to the heart. You cannot break the 10th commandment with your hands. You only break it with your heart. When you covet your neighbor's wife, when you covet your neighbor's house, when you do things in your heart that are not right, that's when you break the 10th commandment. And the Lord is simply saying, if you honor the 10th commandment, you'll not have problems with the other commandments. Keep your heart. So God says the pure heart. This idea of then a lifted up soul seems to be this idea of, in fact, the next psalm, unto thee, O Lord. That's how it opens. Do I lift up my soul unto thee, O Lord? Do I lift up my soul? Oh my God, I trust in thee. Trusting in God and lifting up the soul are parallel thoughts. Oh my God, I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed. Let not mine enemies triumph over me. So who enters? The person who's flawless in speech, the person who's flawless in thought. We have this through Yeshua and only through him. Flawless in speech, but that doesn't mean I need to take it for granted and not give my life to living like this, like it really makes a difference. Flawless in speech, flawless in thoughts, and flawless in action. It says, he shall receive a blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. This idea of receiving righteousness is almost like, in fact, the word actually can mean vindication, like God will vindicate us. And then I'm going to go a little quick here because we're running out of time. This is Jacob, the generation of those who seek. I think that's really interesting because it says Jacob. It doesn't say Israel. Jacob was seeking. Jacob was a seeker of God. He sought. He thought there was blessing from God by honoring his father's blessing so much that he would lie to get it. Esau was willing to sell it for a bowl of beans. Jacob saw value in it. Jacob was a person who was seeking the presence of God. He finally figured it out. Jacob at one point tests God. God, he says, if you'll bring me back to my father's house in peace, Malachi 3, verse 6, then I will tithe of everything you give me, and this pillar, this rock will be a pillar in your temple. And he's running for his life. 20 years later, he comes home. He comes home to his father's house in peace. His father is still alive. The man who was dying 20 years earlier. He's running for his life because his mom says, your dad's about to die, and the day he dies, your brother's going to kill you. So Jacob runs for his life. He's running for his life. And he says, God, if you'll bring me back to my father's house in peace, I'll tithe. God brings him back. His father's still alive. 20 years later, he comes back with 12 sons. And this is why Malachi 3:6 says, this is why you sons of Jacob are not destroyed. He says, you're still here because your great ancestor tested me with the tithe 1,500 years ago. And he came back from that excursion with 12 sons. And then God says in Malachi 3:10, it's time for you to test me with the tithe. That's just one of the most beautiful promises of God. And Donna will be my witness on this. We would be afraid to not tithe. We really would. I don't mean that my testimony. We fully believe it. Jacob sought God. He sought him. And that's why God loved him. And then Psalm 24:7 through the rest of it, that's where I see this song. Fling wide, you heavenly gates. Lift up your heads, O you gates. Be lifted up, you everlasting doors. Notice it doesn't say, lift up, you ancient doors. Some translations have that, but it's not the word for ancient. It's the word olam, which is the word for eternal or everlasting. From everlasting to everlasting, from way back there to way over there, from before there was time to after there is time, from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. And he says here, he says that God is the God. He says, lift up, you everlasting doors, your eternal doors, open up. God is not merely the God of this world. God is the God of eternity. From back before there was time to after there is time. He is the God of eternity. And so the kingship of God is the central theme of this psalm, especially in verses 7 through 10. And so he asks this question, who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O you gates. Lift up, you eternal doors, for the King of glory shall come in. And who is this King of glory? Adonai Tzavot, the Lord of the armies of heaven. That's literally what that means. And as I looked at this psalm, I felt led to do this psalm when I wrote the plan, because I have a schedule for the psalms for the year. And I would have developed this about 2 weeks ago. I had no idea that we would be, today, we've all seen in the news, that Queen Elizabeth died. Great woman, great sovereign, obviously. Okay. She reigned for 70 years. Did a great sovereign. She died. She is not the everlasting queen, but there is an everlasting one, and he is coming. He really is coming. And this psalm is sort of like pointing to that day when when heaven opens and he comes back, and it's like he walks through the eastern gate and he blows it open and he sits down on the throne in Jerusalem. Fling wide, you heavenly gates. Prepare ye the way of the Lord. That's Psalm 24. I love this psalm. So I wish we could I wish I could play that song for you, but you've got the song right there at the end of your handout, and you can go home, and the guy singing it at that link is the same. And if you just get the handout on that Mel had, and she sent it out in the Zoom or in the email, all you'd have to do is click on a PDF. You wouldn't even have to retype it. It'll take you right to it. And the guy who sings it is the same guy who led in it for us last week, about 11 years ago when he was younger. And he's the guy who wrote the song, too. So you'll get blessed. Praise God.